Good evening, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Keller Easterling to CCA tonight as our lecturer for the last lecture in our series this semester. Keller is an architect, a theorist, and a writer from New York, and a professor at Yale University. Keller's research and writing have continuously challenged and expanded the edges of architectural and urban practice, giving us a very provocative lens through which to think the complex political, organizational, and infrastructural networks that govern contemporary urbanization. Her previously published books include Organization, Space, Landscapes, Highways, and Houses in America, a work looking at the ways in which network theory might be applied to American infrastructure and development, and Enduring Innocence, Global Architecture and Its Political Masquerades, published by MIT Press, the latter of which deals with what she refers to as the outlaw architectural spatial products and real estate cocktails of contemporary global societies, and the political platforms, economic maneuverings, and social desires with which these intersect. Her writings bring a very acute, theoretical, and highly inventive perspective to the socio-political landscapes within which we are operating, subjects that are continued in her forthcoming book, Extra State Craft, Global Infrastructure and Political Arts, that will be the subject of her talk this evening. She writes, observing that space has become a mobile, monetized technology, infrastructure might be considered to be not the urban substructure, but the urban structure itself. Massive global infrastructural systems administered by mixtures of private and public cohorts and driven by profound irrationalities generate de facto undeclared forms of polity. Keller has lectured widely in the United States and internationally. She's published over 80 critical articles and book chapters and has worked across multiple media, including installation and film. She was one of the 100 architects selected by Ai Weiwei to design and build a house in Ordos. I think we've had probably half the architects that were in Ordos in our series over the last few years. And her research and design work has been exhibited at many prominent institutions, including the Storefront for Art and Architecture, the Architectural League in New York, and the Rotterdam Biennale. She has also published a number of web installations, including Extra State Craft, Wild Cards, A Game of Orgman, and Highline, Plotting New York City. In addition to the above, she has also been the recipient of many grants and fellowships and honors from the Graham Foundation, the National Endowment of the Arts, the Whitney Humanities Center, and the Holcim Foundation, among others. She holds 2 degrees from Princeton University, and previous to her professorship at Yale, she also taught at Columbia, Pratt, and Parsons. Please join me in welcoming Keller Easterling. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see your school. So energetic and wonderful space. And thank you for being here when you could be off already traveling to see your grandmother or something like that. I guess we'll do that later this week. So if we speed through the images of the space in which we're swimming, the retinal afterglow is of a mix of a soupy matrix of details and repeatable formulas that make most of the space in the world. Buildings that we think of as singularly crafted enclosures or geometric formal objects are often reproducible products, spatial products, that proliferate globally. These are the familiar confetti of brightly colored boxes that are nestled in black asphalt or bright green grass. And now not only buildings but entire cities have become mobile, monetized technologies, almost infrastructural technologies, but not infrastructure like pipes and wires that are hidden underground, but a kind of, far from hidden, a kind of cartoon of abstract economic and technical logics that press into view. And typically the urban formulas replicate something like Shenzhen or Dubai, anywhere in the world with this kind of drumbeat of generic skyscrapers. So as Isla said, from that abstracted, the infrastructure technologies are then, not the urban substructure, the pipes and wires under the ground, but the urban structure itself. I never thought I'd be one of those architects that just has to talk about Victor Hugo, but and I would only mention him now to turn the tables on his familiar argument about the death of architecture. You remember that in Notre Dame de Paris, he famously observed that architecture like that of the cathedral was a registration of human thought, and the cathedral was like a giant with 1,000 heads and 1,000 arms that fixed all this floating symbolism in an eternal, visible, and palpable form. But he predicted, and you remember all of this, that Gutenberg's, that the printed word of Gutenberg would usurp the architectural giant as a vessel of supernatural, cultural, imaginary. It would steal its power. The book would kill the edifice, kill architecture. So you might assume that looking at this kind of contemporary evidence of urban space would only confirm Hugo's assertion about the death of architecture. We don't build cities by accumulating masterpiece buildings. The discipline of architecture is responsible for only a trickle of the world's spaces, while a fire hose blasts out the rest. So architecture is making beautiful stones in the water, but the world is making the water. But I want to argue the opposite, right? I want to argue that if architecture that was killed by the book, that it's reincarnated as something more powerful still as information itself. That I want to argue that the mystifying giant with 1,000 heads and 1,000 arms is alive again in the explosive growth of this fluid material matrix space of global infrastructure. And the information is that it's carrying is not in like a text in a book or in a digital device, but in activity. Invisible, powerful activity that determines how objects and content will be organized and circulated. So it's information that's not carried in wires or microwaves, but in space. That space is the carrier of a non-textual cultural imaginary in a totemic marketplace. And the spatial technologies of infrastructure space have the power and currency, again, not of text, but of software, of a kind of operating system for shaping the city. We know that, or I can very easily say, always say that this one or two sentences that, some of the most radical changes in the globalizing world are being written not in the language of international law or diplomacy, they're being written in the language of architecture and urbanism, in the spatial technologies of this infrastructure space. This matrix space that generates de facto forms of polity faster than even quasi-official forms of governance can legislate it. The world's spatial products operate by orchestrating, and this is important, undeclared activities that are capable of outpacing law. And these massive global infrastructure systems that are administered by all kinds of mixtures of public and private cohorts, often driven by profound irrationalities, form an extra statecraft that's really wilder than any of the leviathans for which we have a familiar leviathans for which we have a studied political response. So that portmanteau extra statecraft, I mean to be both outside of and in partnership with the state. Not taking over the state, but making a kind of proxy and double for the state. When we're looking at this, one thing that's clear is that choosing to focus on making the stone in the water, the object form, is already a beautiful, powerful, completely reasonable artistic choice. But what if the water is also an artistic curiosity? This mysterious, pervasive, hyperbolic, seemingly remote-controlled phenomenon. This flow of information that's carried in activity in space. And what if our spatial training gives us insight into the way it works? What if this matrix space even tutors nothing less than an additional approach to form making that doesn't challenge or duel with our object form making, but actually partners with it to propel it, kind of turbocharge it? What if this matrix space also tutors alternative approach to political arts? And what if this infrastructure space is not like a fairy story monster like the giant, to be opposed, but more like a surrounding magic? And what if the enigmas of this space don't distance it from, but rather return it to the purview of art? That's the only reason really for mentioning Hugo. But this operating system is, I'm sorry, this is coming out in this particular projector, coming out a little pixely, but this operating system is equally mystifying to architects and non-architects. But it seems that wherever I'm asked to speak, because I'm an architect, the expectation is that an architect should, not only deliver evidence of this wide world, but this operating system, but to somehow know how to work on it. And it's not obvious how to leap into this world from kind of standing flat position, or how to leap over a number of cliches or preconceptions that stand as obstacles. I mean, one preconception is that this sort of politicized medium is not in our purview. It's a matter of scientized, rationalized policies. And if I'm speaking to architects, the assumption is that it challenges or dilutes something fundamental about the discipline of architecture, about its practice, its fundamental practice, its fundamental aesthetic training. But one thing that I can report is that while it is true that sometimes the econometrics of quants and McKinsey consultants runs the world, the most interesting thinkers in the world, political and social scientists, are beginning to question their rationalized assumptions and the authorities of their science, to consider political and economic irrationalities in a more complex medium, like this kind of matrix space we're talking about. And actually, whether it's economics or cancer research or informatics, there's been a turn to look at matrix as well as object, or to see object in terms of matrix, so that so many of these people who are thinking about globalization and global politics are actually looking not to the defunct aspects of their own science, but instead they are attracted to our arts and to the spatial medium in which we are working. Another cliche that I often encounter is that political arts have a kind of limited repertoire of righteous resistance and refusal. So to engage in politics comes up against a sort of limit like that. And while there are moments for forthright political declarations, for standing up and giving it a name, there are also moments for asking not what are your politics, but how do you do your politics? And most importantly, the very reason why this kind of space is the secret weapon of some of the most powerful people in the world is that it's a medium of undeclared politics. And working with it requires an extended political repertoire that's shrewder, an extended repertoire of form making as well. It seems that the political world could use from us, in addition to object form making in another register, form making in another part of speech, form making in another gear almost, a kind of active form that propels object form, a kind of, almost like the art of making software, a non-digital software within which architecture is information. An updating platform of spatial variables, a form for handling form. So this is an active form that's not itself a thing, but an approach, and one that I would argue is one that we already know, but one that in which we're under-rehearsed. So, so before I plunge back into a little more evidence, I want to just contemplate for a minute what that might mean, what this alternative mode of form making might mean. Architecture offers, among many other things, an exquisite aesthetic training in the connoisseurship of object, profile, outline. So if we were someone to create something like active form, we would do what we're best trained to make. We would make an object designed to represent action or dynamic process or activity, or action would be equated with program, or be confused with movement or kineticism. We would try to codify it, taxonomize it. We would want to know that. And then how do you assess activity or information exchange and like static arrangement of any kind of familiar spatial infrastructure, like a highway system or an electrical grid or a suburb? We just don't usually treat spaces and urban organizations as if they were actors. We treat them as collections of objects or volume. So that agency would only be assigned to the moving cars or the electrical current or the inhabitants. They were less accustomed to the idea that space, rather than code or text, can be a carrier of information. Unless it's unless it's coded with sensors or information technologies or something like that. But however static, spaces possess agency that resides in relationship and relative position. Space itself is a carrier of information. It doesn't have to be coded with sensors. As Gregory Bateson famously said, a man, a tree, and an axe is an information system. Or think of the way that a computer scientist would never fully attempt to represent the internet, but would author some active forms or softwares or multipliers that ride the network. So they design forms for handling forms. Or a forester wouldn't try to wire every bird to every tree, but would send in active players that inflect the ecologies over time. Or an entrepreneur, designs not only the product, but also its passage through the market. You're designing active forms. But maybe the idea isn't really so familiar. Maybe we know about it. Again, sorry, these images are pixely. Here's a technology of stick construction, and there's a script about home ownership or Cape Cod or early American houses, something like that accompanies it. But the overwhelming architecture is an architecture of activity, an almost agricultural process of making houses. And that activity, it makes certain things possible and certain things impossible in this space, or harder. So the organization is enacting something like a disposition to multiply, a disposition that's even at odds with the declared script about home ownership or early American houses. The organization is saying something different from what it's doing. And it turns out that a lot of the organizations that we are swimming in are doing that, right? That we can begin to separate what they're saying and what they're doing. We can see that they are enacting something. Think about DARPANET, first scripted as a stealth network for the military that becomes the Internet Commons, or Facebook. That's a software scripted for social networking, but it possesses some other undeclared property that allows it to unfold in the Arab Spring as an instrument of dissent, or this limited access highway promoted with stories about freedom and nonstop movement possesses an organizational logic that actually promotes congestion. So in all those cases, information resides in some undeclared or activity or capacity that's imminent in the arrangement or organization. Just like this ball that, it doesn't have to roll down the hill to possess the capacity to do so. It possesses it in a latent arrangement, in relationship between geometry and position. So I get excited about all these examples, and I want to get these spatial relationships and activities between my hands, since the world spins often not around the declared, the nameable, the object, but around the undeclared. It's certainly all the spaces that I look at that are, as I was saying before, the secret weapons of the most powerful people on earth. So if we can, come to this space and we can, redesign a single house with object form. We've been really well trained to do that. But I think we're often bewildered by the way that our object form continues to be outwitted by some larger process that's controlled elsewhere. So what if we, sort of choosing a different site within the same site, design a multiplier or a contagion that uses the organization as a carrier that will replicate within many houses. So we would be changing this landscape almost like the elevator changed urban morphology. The elevator was a germ that utterly changed the city, a contagion. Right? So if we try out some of the faders and toggles of this spatial software, it's obvious that one of them would be something like a multiplier or a germ that you could send into repetitive populations of matrix space. But what are others? The designer of a kind of software of active forms is designing not the field in its entirety, but rather a delta, or the means by which the field changes, not only the shape or contour of a game piece, but also the repertoire for how it plays. So a spatial software designs not just the object, but also something like a valve or a governor or a switch that directs a flow of multiple objects. And that can even be a remote-controlled flow of multiple objects. Or it can be like a functional expression for space, like a cosine x. You don't know all the values, but you know that it creates a disposition or propensity in organization, a form for handling forms. And we know something about patterns of connectivity, the network topology in organization. In fact, topology was originally, an urban puzzle, the Königsberg Bridge problem. We know about the disposition that's in certain organizations, like a hub and spoke, or a linear, or an all-channel network. We know the difference between serial and parallel. So we're making active form and we're changing not the object form, we're just changing how the object form is wired in a way, changing their relationship to each other. We even know something very clearly about the political disposition of any one of these organizations, how they concentrate power and authority, how they restrict information. My favorite example of a spatial software is Savannah, which is an 18th century American city. You know, Oglethorpe didn't design the plat. In other words, he didn't design like a plat that you see the outline of the town and every lot within it. He designed a software, or a set of interdependencies, or for a growth protocol. So the town would grow by these wards, which each of them had they described a percentage of public and private space. And with every one of those wards, you also got agricultural space beyond. So it was an active form, a form for handling forms that produced no single object. You didn't necessarily know what the outline of the entire town was, but you had an explicit, measured spatial instruction. So this approach, and now I want to go back to look at some evidence, but this approach is a kind of a non-modern proposition, right? It's not a Manichaean struggle between object form and active form. It's a propulsion, sort of turbocharging of object form, a way of extending our reach or giving special powers to the object form that we make in a way that might have more consequences in this complex global political soup. So it's not a challenge to the magic we already know, but a way to enhance it and maybe get release into an extended territory of operation. So if we take the contemplation back to the world of evidence, I can say quite easily that first the world does have a dominant software for space. It's called the free zone, and it's the information technology that the world now uses to make cities. And as a software, it's, you know, more primitive than MS-DOS. It's just a relatively dumb enclave form that produces suboptimal economic results, and no one even knows why we're using it, except that we're using it, because it's a highly contagious world city paradigm that delivers incentivized urbanism that the world's addicted to. And the wild mutations of this form over the last 30 years make the world look insanely penetrable. It has ancient roots in the pirate enclaves and free ports of the Easterlings. The Easterlings were my people. The Hansa traders are my free trade zone crook ancestors. So I'm uniquely qualified to speak to you on this. But the zone mutated from early 20th century warehouse compound for storing, you know, custom free trade to a mid-century UN-promoted export processing zone, which was a formula for jump-starting the economies of developing countries. So that's, you know, where you get the maquiladoras and other export processing zones. But operating, it's important to understand that they operate with authorities independent from their host country and from the domestic laws of that host country. So the zone typically provides special infrastructures and incentives like tax exemptions, forward ownership of property, streamlined customs, cheap labor, and also deregulation of labor and environmental regulations. So this is the place you want to go. You know, these are the tax havens. These are the lubricated political lacunae. So while it remained in the backstage, the zone growth accelerated exponentially after China adopted it as a market experiment. And soon after, because they you know, housed the zone in entire cities, now soon after every program from business and residential, cultural resort wanted to locate in the zone to enjoy its lubricated political situation. So the zone, having swallowed the city whole, and now the zone takes center stage as the germ of a city building epidemic that reproduces the glittering mimics of Dubai and Singapore and Hong Kong all around the world. So it, you know, it used to look like this, or this, still does look like this in some places, or this, but it now also looks like this, or this, or this. And while in the 60s there were a handful of zones in the world, today there are thousands, with some measured in hectares and some in square kilometers. And the zone is the nexus of every global technology, a kind of clean slate, one-stop entry into the economy of a foreign country. It's the site of headquartering for every global player. And it's also become a self-perpetuating agent of this kind of extra-state territory. It can even be a trademark form of urbanism, as this Techno-Park Alliance is. This is Skolkovo outside Moscow. And in its sweatshops and dormitories are still hidden sites of the most appalling, grisly labor abuse, even though it looks cleaned up from the outside. Zones maintain autonomous control over a closed loop of activity, so they're kind of isomorphic. They have a kind of special stupidity, and their isomorphic disposition permits no contradiction. It's a naturalized, legalized form of lawlessness. And now, surpassing irony, major cities and even national capitals, supposedly the center of law, have created their own kind of zone doppelgangers that allow the state and the non-state actors to use each other as brand and proxy and camouflage. This is New Songdo City, which is a double of Seoul in South Korea, in the Incheon Free Trade Zone. It's what the developer Stanley Gale has called City in a Box, and he wants to build more of them. KPF, you know, designed this. It's based on New York, Venice, and Sydney, and it's filled with commercial, residential, cultural, educational programs, has every conceivable program. It has a Central Park, a World Trade Center, a canal street. And again, as I was saying, surpassing irony, Astana, which is the newly minted capital of Kazakhstan, as a free zone. This is President Nazarbayev's new Paleo-Genghis competition with Dubai. So while created to be apolitical, the zone is in the crosshairs of global politics. This is the Palace of Peace and Reconciliation by Foster and Partners in Astana. So the zone has also become a strange form of intentional community, and for all its intentions to be a tool of economic and logistical rationality, it's become a perfect crucible of irrationality, run by the silly patois and of management ease, with palaces and resorts where petrodollars can get away to relax. So what can we do? We can build a new skyscraper in the zone, and that would be important work. It would be an experiment of one sort or another that would be part of our exquisite aesthetic training. But there are also other active forms that we might deploy. It's obvious that the zone is a highly contagious multiplier. So one could use it as a carrier of anything, a new program, new technology, new vehicle. And you might ask yourself, will Masdar city, which is what we're looking at here, or any of the experiments within it, be contagious? Also, given the zone's ambition to be a city, it also already carries the genetics of its own antidote. So I predict that the next smartest zone entrepreneur will simply ask, why enclave? Why not map the same incentives onto the city itself? Why not make a kind of anti-zone that doesn't create an exurban enclave, but swaps out the topology or the wiring of the zone, so that the infrastructure is mapped onto Nairobi and Guadalajara and Moscow and Quito instead of outside of these cities. And some spatial entrepreneur, I predict, is going to, or I'd like to spread this rumor at least, is going to discover, for instance, that the greater populations of people within those cities generate juicier profits that maybe overwhelm some of the security risks, and finally more directly return financial benefits to the domestic economy. I mean, for us, it's elementary urbanism. We know why the city would do that, why swapping out that topology would do that. But there's a significant difference for us between being the one who can make a master plan for a city and being the one who can possess an alteration that would be a contagious multiplier in the zone population. And an architecture career that made this idea contagious would not be designing not only one thing, but making a calculated design at a population of things. But let's look at, so in some ways be saying, kind of no solutions, please. No absolute single prescription. I'd rather make a valve or a switch that's controlling a flow of solutions. Something that's not about knowing a single thing, but about knowing how, as Gilbert Ryle would say. But let's go to another kind of site. If we can look perhaps at the next huge spatial infrastructural switch in your lifetime, by dropping down into East Africa, specifically Kenya, to sample the spatial effects of broadband mobile telephony. And East Africa was the last place on Earth to receive international fiber optic cable from the ocean, a submarine cable. But now it's one of the places that's poised to experiment the most explosive telecommunications growth. So at the beginning of 2009, with all the fiber optic cable lying at the bottom of the sea, East Africa was still relying on expensive satellite broadband, which you can no longer use that. to do global business. And not only that, but it was costing them 20 to 40 times the equivalent in the developing world for a country that has, very low wages and GDP. But now it has 3 international cables. It's flush with broadband that's serving a dense population of cell phones. And in many developing countries like Kenya, cell phones are also the main way to access the internet. Still, the fixed lines are not, doing so well. So Kenya went from something like this to something like this. And while the world had 750, this is important, while the world had 750 million cell phone subscribers in 2000, now there are over 5.6 billion, and 3/4 of these are in the developing world. So the mobile phone is the world's largest shared platform, and broadband infrastructure is touted as a resource that's almost as important as water. The fixed linear fiber that's buried in the ground, it territorializes almost like a railroad or a highway. But the population of cell phones is more atomized. And in between those two, there are many crucial choke points. Anywhere along the line, you can create a kind of bottleneck. I think any urbanist worth their salt would say we would know about relationships of highways and railroads to the city. But we're under-rehearsed in the spatial consequences of broadband and mobile telephony. We just don't know, how to even begin to think about it. Even though I think it's pretty easy to say cell phones are something like the new elevator in terms of the enormous consequences they're going to have on morphology. Broadband and mobile telephony alter the very terms of city, village, road, school, market. It's the easy example that you all know is that, for instance, collapses the distance between farm and market. So you don't need to carry your beans all the way to market. You can check on your cell phone to see what price you're going to be offered. And there's many, many, many things like that changing daily. And in Kenya, there's plenty of economists and quants and those 28-year-old McKinseyites on the ground, and bankers, and development expertise is spoken in the languages of business and technology and informatics, econometrics, and all these guys are trying to predict the impact of broadband on what they call development 2.0. They're basically often trying to kind of create correlations between, mathematical correlations between broadband and GDP, that kind of thing. So it's banking, it's banking or it's informatics. And there are also plenty of entrepreneurs who are writing software for billions of these cell phones. This is M-Pesa, which started in Kenya. You know about it. It's a kind of cell phone banking, and now everybody around the world uses it. Many people around the world use this for remittances, for getting money home. The entrepreneurs know how to use the cell phone as a multiplier, as a carrier of all kinds of new relationships that have enormous spatial consequences. In fact, the new business models in the world now, whereas they used to come from the US and then they stopped coming from the US and they started coming from Japan, now they've stopped coming from Japan, they're starting to come from these, from the developing world, from densely populated countries in the developing world. But after all, that the spatial consequences of either these banking formulas or new softwares are treated as kind of accidental byproducts of the softwares or the formulas. No one's deliberately writing the protocols that start with space and study the interdependencies between ICT infrastructure and space in what we could call urbanism 2.0. Even though it's very clear that the way space is arranged in relation to the cell phone and to fixed line broadband will be a major determining factor of how accessible, how resilient the networks are in the long run. These are socio-technical networks. They are made by feedback between the technology and humans. So technological actors, as we were saying before, and human actors. They make each other. Just in the same way that we make the computer and then we think more like a computer, and the way then our computer brains make more computers. in these socio-technical networks, space and the arrangement of them will affect how they are developed. But unfortunately, the only software, the only spatial software that's being offered is the generic and outmoded zone. That's what's on offer. Even as the capacities of broadband enhance the possibility of the anti-zone we were just talking about. For instance, here in Kenya is a project called LAPSET, which is treated like a really good idea. LAPSET is a transportation corridor between Lamu on the coast, can you see it there, and Juba, which is the new capital of South Sudan. And it's going to be a big transportation corridor that is studded with zone cities and resorts, and it will carry oil to the coast. So while Kenya is poised to finally sort of use this technology that in some ways inverts expectations about the need for certain kinds of development, it certainly inverts the expectation about the need for roads, for instance, which we think of as wonderful signs of progress. But in this case, they could use cell phones to provide intelligent forms of rural development that preserve wilderness and wildlife for tourism, that create remote global schools, all kinds of things. And yet it's adopting an old and potentially quite dangerous development formula that's around resource extraction. You know what's happened to every country in Africa that gets near oil extraction. So just as Oglethorpe altered speculation with that Savannah formula, that's why he did it. He was doing it to try to curb speculation. Space might be a primary variable that's part of offsets and bargains that a country makes as the world is eyeing its market, and the world, all eyes are on, East Africa and some of these other highly populated countries. So the smarter developing countries are offering offsets as as part of a contemporary extra statecraft. You will have access to this in our country, but then you have to do something in return. And I'm arguing, that space should be a variable in these offsets. For instance, a protocol that puts cell phones and roads in a new relationship would be an especially productive urbanism 2.0. But what if we move to some places in the world that could use our ability to make active form, or another place that could use our ability to make active form or form making in another gear? If there are many places in the world where what's needed is not the development machine put into forward to make more object form, but rather what's needed is a development machine put into reverse. And this might be something that we know how to do. Making object form doesn't help us to do this, but making active form does, and it relies on all that we know about space, volume, urbanism. In the Amazon rainforest or in McMansion's suburbia, it's considered entirely rational, even though it's irrational, to leave it to the economists running the carbon market or to the quants of the financial industry to link properties, to link our nice McMansion to the, take it to a whole set of mortgage properties, mortgage packages that are then threaded through different banks all around the world. This seems perfectly rational to us, even though it isn't. Even though the result can link space to untraceable volatility, even while the physical effects on the ground are very durable. But what if we use multipliers, remotes, and governors to craft interdependencies between properties where the risks and the rewards were more visible and tangible, and where all the values of property are in play, not just the mortgage value, or not just the carbon emissions value, but land, home, agriculture, soil, climate, resources? What if we could use those to put that development machine in reverse. Imagine a kind of subtraction protocol, like Savannah in reverse, or like a reverse game of Go, where not walls, but clearings are the object. A subtraction protocol that's like a ratchet that links properties or relieves failed properties by concentrating densities elsewhere, potentially making both more stable and more fluid forms of development, like a cosine X. You could imagine it proceeding through an accumulation of very simple moves, just by densifying property, and increased taxes or revenues from that property could help to relieve sites that are toxic or decreased in value. And when cleared sites organize a new enterprise, they in turn generate and share revenues. And value, just like the reverse game of Go, value now is in the clearing and in the surface area of the clearing. And the heavy industry of subtraction becomes a market that produces jobs and profits commensurate with the construction industry. So a subtraction protocol might be appropriate in many parts of the world where, for instance, we have some kind of sprawling overdevelopment that's attracted distended or failed markets, where development confronts environmental issues, where it would be wise to retreat from exhausted land or floodplains, where special land preserves are valued. It also might offer some less violent tools of acquisition and more safeguards against disenfranchisement in the margins of informal settlement. So even though this is kind of being rehearsed in the McMansion landscape, it's turning the tables on the idea of that kind of development. But in the last few minutes, I just also want to return to the second cliche that I mentioned at the beginning, that this cliche that politics is a matter of forthright, righteous resistance or refusal. We could probably quite easily agree on the abuses of people and environment that we oppose. And there are many of them in the spaces that I've just shown you. Some forms of political activism demand declaration, where strongly held, forthright beliefs galvanize a fight for solidarity or justice or decency, where David kills Goliath. And yet, while there are moments to stand up and give it a name, sometimes the problem is not knowing that, but knowing how. And righteousness is often fooled by the sneaky way that the world works. Sometimes the real power players use those undeclared activities of space because it lets them wander away from the bullseye. And what one finds is not an epic binary tale of enemies and innocence, but that a little epidemic of rumor or duplicity finally captures the world's attention. And the idea that there's a proper realm of forthright political negotiation even acts as the perfect camouflage for this more elusive, sort of sneakier behavior. Goliath comes dressed as David, and dissent's often left shaking its fists at an effigy or exhausting itself and escalating the very tensions that it hoped to diffuse. Even by only insisting on proper forms of political resistance, forecloses on the very dissensus that it wishes to instigate. So just as many of the most powerful regimes use proxies and doubles in this kind of extra statecraft, I like to imagine an unwitting, maybe even unwelcome auxiliary or cohort that helps the more righteous activists with an unorthodox form of activism. And don't mistake this for equivocation or collusion, and it's not a position for the pure or faint of heart, since it involves swimming in some of the same waters with all the other shills and butlers and confidence men. But I've long been writing about a less self-congratulatory, less automatically oppositional, but potentially effective and sneakier set of techniques. Techniques like gifts, pandas, exaggerated compliance, gossip, rumors, multipliers, contagions, remote controls, entrepreneurialism. And you know, a panda or a gift is a kind of sweet, arm-twisting handshake, like China's gift to Taiwan of two pandas whose names were Unity, or in Domination and the Arts of Resistance, James C. Scott provides a wonderful example of a kind of exaggerated compliance, the opposite of what we think of as sort of tense resistance and refusal. And in it, he draws attention to a portion of Milan Kundera's The Joke. It's a novel about prisoners, and the prisoners in the story are challenged to a relay race against their camp guards. And the prisoners decide to run very slowly against the sprinting guards. Meanwhile, they're cheering each other on, and it's their exaggerated compliance that brings them together in an act of defiance, but an act of defiance that doesn't diminish their energies with kind of symmetrical competition and fighting. But different from collusion, this exaggerated compliance disarms, delivers independence from authority. Think about the child that is so good that they control their parents, or even Occupy this past week by doing a better job than FEMA of getting relief to the Sandy victims is doing a kind of exaggerated form of compliance that empowers them. This extended repertoire of form making that's both more elusive and powerful, multipliers, remotes, topologies, or subtraction, among others, become techniques for the same techniques we were talking about of active form, become techniques for this political art. Powers already present in these networks is not necessarily an obstacle, but rather a means to amplify or leverage or exploit. So in this repertoire, we want to have a sneakier David in the David and Goliath story. A sneakier David wouldn't bother to kill Goliath, but would use Goliath to do the work, use Goliath's large power to amplify an alteration. The remote controls allow an activist also to indirectly influence circumstances, often without being detected. Rumor and gossip is one of those multipliers. It's common to the tools for destabilizing power. All of the multipliers present in infrastructure space facilitate that same magic. Think about the way rumor works. For instance, a rumor that Obama was not born in the U.S. or that Obama was Muslim is beautifully crafted precisely because it was easy to refute. It's not that it was somehow it was not delegitimized by being further from the truth. It worked better because it was further from the truth. The rumor was kept alive twice as long and repeated twice as much because it was easy to refute. So rumor and gossip tutor us on this idea of active forms because they're less reliant on content, on the that, but on the how, on the bounce of the rumor. That's the active form that must also be designed. In an advanced studio a few years, we presented in reviews and in an exhibition at Storefront called Some True Stories, mixtures of fact and fiction. So the design ideas themselves were spreading a rumor that the world had changed. One of these was, for instance, the rumor, well, not so, although it happens to be true, that the floor is now the most important architectural surface, and new vehicles like that are mergers of elevators and AGVs and cars are creating new building morphologies with enormous consequence to the environment. another project that was designed for a high-speed rail in the desert that traveled to Vegas. Several months after the exhibition was, and began to be confused with a twin project that was launched in California. I'll leave you to guess which one is the real and which one is the fake or the hoax. And I just have to go now to an exposition about, to a convention about the free trade zone organized by the people who organize free trade zones. And I plan to give them a special a special panda gift, which is the prediction that I just made when I was talking about zones. That the next really smart zone entrepreneur is the zone entrepreneur that's going to map the zone back onto the city, that I've heard about it, that I know that it's the right thing, and I'm going to do this. I pledge to you. And if you think also about something like a kind of entrepreneurialism, usually an artist or an architect or an activist thinks that they're going to author the object that reveals their soul, that alters the world with a permanently useful or memorable masterpiece or reform. That's the way we think. But an entrepreneur does exactly the opposite. They are thinking about what the other person wants and then how to get them to change their mind about what they want over and over and over again. An updating platform for ideas and products. In school, we usually get something more like a kind of masterpiece class where you learn to perform Hamlet's soliloquy, if this were a drama school. Not the improvisation class where you learn to rehearse your reactivity. You learn to do what an entrepreneur does by continually thinking about that updating platform, so that this is not a utopian, perfect revolution that sort of follows ecclesiastical plot lines, but is more like a constant mode of revolutionizing. Misdirections and distractions of hustlers and Chauncey Gardners can also lull and redirect the most intractable political situations. Comedy similarly distracts and diffuses tension, while it destabilizes and all the self-satisfied critiques as well as the most hollow consensus. So that all these techniques, I hope, offer not tense binaries of resistance, but release into a new territory. So when we pan back over this matrix space, maybe we see nothing but artistic opportunities with additional kinds of pleasure and excess where the action is to form. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Open up for questions. Yeah.
I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but I'm wondering, do you feel comfortable maybe trying to talk about examples in the world that you've seen of and I'm kind of reluctant to believe that in this world an individual really can, I don't know how to define that, but an individual can really make any sort of meaningful impact, but you seem to believe that there is some avenues of opportunity which you've outlined for us. Are you able to talk about anyone that you think has successfully made ripples with their stones in the water?
The problem with answering that question is that I won't be able to tell you enough, and that any one that I tell you will sound anecdotal and weak. But there are, I think there are many practitioners around the world that have a kind of hunger to be effective in the ways that we were outlining now. I mean, they're passing across my mind, but to mention any one of them doesn't. It's going to sound trivial somehow. I think, again, this is one of those things where it's not about knowing that, but about knowing how. It is an approach, not a. And you fill the approach with all the things that you fill it with. There's not a sort of single prescription. I think your question, though, is not asking that, and it's a legitimate question. You know, who is doing this? I mean, I think we can all think of architects that have a kind of entrepreneurial spirit. We can all think of architects who are doing work in these parts of the global economy. But I do think it is a little bit sort of scripted in a certain way, you know, that if you're doing this, then you're doing housing for people, or you're helping disaster relief, and that's what makes you a political architect. So I think that's like sort of some of the obstacles I was talking about at the beginning. There's a kind of persistent script that goes with our global political activity that I do want to kind of change the channel on, or add other channels of activity. Yes.
So I have a question that follows that. It seems that one of the implications is that we have an educational system in architecture that really focuses on making objects. So to really access this at a scale, we really would need to change the educational system, and not just this course here, that course there. You really are sort of, I think, implying that we really need to start thinking at other scales if we're going to engage this, and not just simply make an object and plug into someone else's system. So that's the question. I mean, just, and it would feel like it needs to be done on the level of the educational system.
Well, I hasten always to say that I think we in architecture school are, you know, we are learning, you know, one of the fundamental things we have to learn is is object form, and it's an aesthetic training, object and outline, and I would never, and this, so what I'm talking about is not taking anything away from that. That is there, but to add to it, to empower that object form, or, you know, as I was saying, to turbocharge it, give it a way to actually make some entry in some of the more intractable systems in the world that in which one is not asking, in which there's not clients or typical client relationships. Yes, I mean, we have to have some way of rehearsing that, and it's not rehearsing the delivery system of an object to or delivery system of any kind of design in response to an assignment. It is, I think, rehearsing a kind of reactivity in the world, and an entrepreneurialism in the world. That has to be, I mean, it has to be rehearsed, but it also has to be funded. We were just talking, you know, the profession of architecture does not have the funding of the sciences. It doesn't even have the funding of the arts to begin to try out other modes of practice that shift authority and increase our powers in the world. But I just want to hasten to say that this is not to say, you know, sometimes when one talks about global politics, because of so many of the moral consequences of various good and bad actors in the world, the assumption is that to talk about these things is to be saying, oh, we ought to do this. We ought to do this because this is, you know, morally right or something. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is an artistic curiosity that needs to be satisfied. Your morals are your own, those kinds of ethical discussions are struggles, not declarations in my worldview. That was a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
I kept going back to Deleuze and Guattari in their Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and there's something going on. It's a while back, but there's something going on about that, the kind of finding other references for action within space. It's kind of, I'm thinking in terms of like, you're talking profile and outline, and then, but there's shadow. And it's kind of in the shadow space, because it actually changes according to precise location. That's what is so missing in all of these images that you've shown, except that tribal person with the cell phone. We laughed because finally there was some identity. Everything else was so non-identifiable. It could be anywhere. It's the anywhereness, right? That kind of the placelessness. So there's something to me about specificity, questioning in like sanity versus insanity, and finding specificity that creates identity. Like, how do we actually belong anywhere? When you enter into these kinds of places, that's kind of, it's your stripped of belonging, because it could be anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are. So I just want to kind of see if you are, where you're thinking in terms of that, that reference versus like localization, reclaiming place.
I'm not working on place. You know, I'm not working on it. I'm working on trying to get my hands on some of these more powerful faders and toggles that are creating this kind of generic, repeatable space. So I'm not trying to correct it with any particular notion of space. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. You know, I'm trying to get those tools in our hands to do whatever we want to do with regard to space and place. But I'm not thinking about any one specific cure or reform of those spaces. And part of it is just information. I mean, I don't know whether you were made uncomfortable by the aerials, you know, by you don't see any people in them. Or even the thing when just starting, which was the ghost city, and I didn't identify it, I'm sorry, a ghost city in Africa, that in Angola, that Chinese companies have built, but no one's living in it. You know, I like to use that imagery, in part because there's nothing else I can show you, and to begin to kind of evoke something of the systemic and repeatable nature of these kinds of spatial products. But, you know, I was just going to put it where, if I can start this back again. But some people are concerned about the aerials and about the fact that that it doesn't sort of, from a human perspective. I'm just not really, that's just not my project right now. I'm really just trying to get hold of, or get us closer to some of the power that makes these kinds of spaces. And the, you know, how they might be remade or changed is sort of another chapter, I suppose. Although the idea that's implicit in taking the zone and mapping it back onto the city, I mean, we all know what that means, you know. Like we, as urbanists, know what that means and what the consequences of that would be because of all the powers and consequences of urbanism on people in a city as big and thriving as Nairobi or or Quito or Guadalajara or Mexico City or Moscow. So it's implicit. I was going to say something else, but I'll stop.
What was the other question? Because I was curious about your analogies to economy and financial markets. And one could almost argue that, you know, if you look at the kind of the crisis that occurred 4 years ago, some would say that actually that those financial markets were wildly successful for their ability to manipulate, control, succeed in what they were doing at the expense of everybody else except themselves. Right? Because, I mean, you could almost say that the self-destruction was everybody else's self-destruction, and they got out scot-free. Kind of, you know, they manipulated the system so well in a guerrilla style, overcomplicating what they were arranging and what and so forth. Do you see that as kind of an analogy as to what it is that you're talking about, like the ability to control it so well that you actually, I mean, it almost feels like what they did was rude, that they subverted the system that we thought we knew for personal gain. Is that how you see maybe some of this playing out?
Oh, you mean some of the counter plays? Yeah, why not? That you use the giant, you know.
The follow-up question to that is that they already had power embedded in them, which allowed them to manipulate it further. And I feel like, you know, more and more architects struggle with actually finding some sort of empowerment to actually grab onto to augment or to multiply. You know, it seems like we're always forever in a crisis of like having to co-opt another industry in order to have some validation. So, like, where do you know? It's kind of a cliche question, I guess, but where do we find power? Like, where does the first grain exist almost for us to amplify or to multiply?
I mean, I suspect you're about 30 minutes away from thinking of, or 5 minutes away from thinking of about a dozen of this. I mean, you know, like such examples of what you could do to, or who you know, what stream you could get in. But if we were any of us thinking about being architects who worked on global politics, we might not give ourselves the permission to do that, because that's, you know, in the grand, you know, kind of Tafurian endgame, that's collusion, right? Or it's riding the wave, or some other, you know, selling out or something like that. So we don't get a chance to rehearse kind of sneakier version of that, you know. But you know, we were talking about changes in the education of an architect. In my studios, where we actually do improvisation class instead of masterpiece class, and in seminars where we've been working on architecture and entrepreneurialism, it only takes another half hour, you know, to get to all those examples, and they're your examples, but the opportunities present themselves. It's just, you know, giving ourselves a chance to rehearse it. You can't just kind of, from standing flat, think about how to do it. And with your colleagues, you also get more ideas. And
thank you so much. When you're talking and showing these spaces, it sort of reminded me of Jane Jacobs and how she wrote about how cities have sort of been separated out into various parts that. And yeah, I guess I sort of see that from a Marxist perspective, the way you have like primitive accumulation, where you basically decollectivize and simplify social organizations so that all sort of desires need to plug into the economy, and yeah, it seems like maybe it could be highly contagious, and even through markets, to begin to introduce a spatial form that begins to, I'm hesitant to say commodify, but introduces within a commodity the benefits of community, or sort of re-collectivizing, through some new type of typology. Do you think there's any potential for maybe like a new residential, commercial architecture that has that as sort of an added benefit that those who are controlling decisions would go for? Because it begins to sort of be like almost like an externality, or something that doesn't need to be incorporated in production costs, it just is implicit within the form.
Well, I think that I was trying to present this kind of subtraction protocol, but I mean, it could be filled with any number of different kinds of variables, variables for subtraction, or variables just for interdependencies between properties that are, where, like Savannah, I mean, I think an entrepreneur, a smart entrepreneur of new forms of housing could easily work with an idea like that. And we know that, Hernando de Soto's idea that if people who are in informal settlements are given deeds to their property, that helps legitimize and make a community. But then, David Harvey comes along and says, no, that only is the avenue to real final disenfranchisement, where the developers will buy their properties. But what if you did have something that was almost like modeled a cross between Oglethorpe and microfinance or something, where there are just micro shares, that are owned between properties that you can see right in front of you, not that are shares in something that's going to be threaded through a Swiss bank and a tax haven in Dubai and something and come back on the other end, but something that you can see. How would that work? Could that even stabilize some of the more dangerous or fragile positions that someone in a ghost suburb outside of Las Vegas is feeling right now, or something that someone in an informal settlement at the edge of a megacity anywhere in the world? Like, is there something like that could work? In any case, if one thinks not just in objects, but we were talking about Deleuze before, in dispositif, in disposition, in variables and interdependencies between space, with all the things we know about space, not the things bankers know about mortgages, but the things we know about space in interdependent dispositional relationships. What could we do? There's many things we could do. Just on the other side of object form, there's all these other possibilities.